and the rest of the world. Fabian socialism became famous, sort of in almost all corners of the sort of former British Empire, due to the work of Laski and people like him in inspiring particularly the first generation of sort of independence actors, as from the end of the Second World War onwards. And that's why the Fabian Society is well known and loved and imitated in sort of all corners of the world, and of course particularly in India, where our focus will be today. Sort of the independence generation of leaders were incredibly inspired by Fabian socialist politics. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot about that. I just want to say a little bit about Laski as a Fabian. So sometimes when you sort of look at sort of quick sketches of Laski, there's sort of talk about him having a sort of a Fabian phase of his sort of intellectual journey, and then sort of moving towards a Marxist phase. But actually, when you look at his career, he was a Fabian and a leading light in the work of the society from the very early 1920s through to his death, and was a member of the Fabian Society's executive committee for much of that time, and was actually called very near, for a couple of years before he died in the late 40s, just after the war, was the chair of the Fabian Society, and managed to sack one of my predecessors as part of that, and wrote some key practical documents all the way in the 20s and 30s, as well as the 40s, that were very sort of practically oriented about what the Labour Party should do there and then. So, of course, he was interested in, if you like, sort of political ideas, but he was also very much a practicing political actor. And I think that's why, so it's so important to remember his association with the Fabian Society and its transmission into the thinking of the Labour Party. So that's sort of why the Fabian Society cares about Laski. But I'm now delighted to hand over to our contributors this afternoon. And we're going to start with Michael Cox, who was also at our last seminar and spoke incredibly eloquently about the foundation of the LSE. So Michael, it's brilliant to sort of move the story on 20 years and hear about sort of the influence and inspiration of Harold Laski.
Well, Andrew, for that, I hope this is being heard clearly. You mentioned Laski and Fabianism, and the last few years of his life, of course, were not entirely happy ones, because he got involved in a court case. But one of the interesting things about Laski is not only how much he wrote, but how long he wrote. And one of the first things I ever read of Laski's was an introduction to the Communist Manifesto, which came out in 1948. And it must be the only introduction to a book which is longer than the book itself, which is really quite remarkable. But it's actually extraordinarily interesting analysis of how Laski himself related to the Marxist tradition and to Marx. And it was ambiguous, it wasn't quite straightforward. But again, it shows you the range, because the first thing he wrote, 40, 50 years earlier, was almost a liberal analysis of sovereignty, even before he came to the LSE. Very quickly on India, if I could just mention that. Of course, Harold died in 1950, sadly. He was then replaced by Michael Oakeshott. I would simply say a kind of a pretty profound conservative, but a very interesting one, without a doubt. And that also marked a great transitional moment, I would say, in the history of the school itself. And I think it was regarded as such, and certainly was regarded by Laski's admirers and friends within the Fabian Society. And in terms of legacy, if I could just quickly move on to that before going back, because I think it's better to start at the end rather than at the beginning, if I might. Thereafterwards, I think Laski didn't disappear from the political scene in terms of influence. I think many of his books were continually read, but the Cold War didn't do Harold Laski's ideas very much favors, let's be perfectly honest about it. But the one place in the world where he was remembered most was, of course, India. And in 1954, the Harold Laski Institute was, in fact, created in India. When Harold died, very quickly afterwards, Nehru said, "We in India are particularly grateful for his staunch advocacy for Indian freedom." Krishna Menon, who you mentioned earlier on, whom he met firstly in 1925, said he's one of us. So I think this deep relationship that Laski had with India, I think it's not just incidental. I think it's crucial to his whole life. What I'll do very briefly in the few moments I've got, just give a little bit of background, a little bit of biography, just a scene set a bit. As you know, Harold was born in Manchester, a very Orthodox Jewish family, by the way, in 1893, which also created problems for him when he married a Gentile, Frida, who remained his partner, friend, comrade, and wife for the rest of his life. They married very young. He went to Manchester Grammar School. He then went to New College, Oxford, although he was not a Wykehamist, certainly was not. And actually, in his first year, he studied science, which is quite interesting. And that also brings us back to this whole question of eugenics. You know, he'd certainly been influenced by Karl Pearson, and some of those ideas did come in. And I think, again, if we're going to engage with that relationship between early socialism and eugenics, it's very, very important. It is not simply incidental. I think that's something we do need to discuss and what it actually meant, as opposed to what I think some people think it meant. He studied science for the first year at New College, but immediately went on to history and politics and political theory. And I hope this doesn't upset Simon if I say this. I always call Harold Laski a political theorist, less a political scientist, as I think it is sometimes understood today, Simon. I don't think he certainly would have liked your work, I'm sure, but I think he would looked at a lot of American political science and wondered if it's really politics, because really he was a political theorist in that classical British and English tradition from his Oxford days. He took the first job he could get, which was in Canada at McGill, and then he moved very, not too long afterwards, 2 or 3 years later, he went to Yale, he went to Harvard, he wrote on law. He also helped establish the New School of Social Research in New York, which is still there today, a kind of radical institution. And I think that was very, very indicative of where his politics was moving. I'd also say something here about America. America played a big role in Harold's life. Much of the left is too identified with what I call crude anti-Americanism. Harold Laski never bought into that particular problem. You know, he always had a deep affection for the United States. He could always see what was wrong with it. But many of his most interesting letters are written to Americans, including, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, Supreme Court judges like Wendell Holmes, Felix Frankfurter. The very young Harold had no problem, because he was so self-confident, and let's be perfectly honest, very, very brilliant, in engaging with people of the very highest intellectual quality. And in America, I think he found actually something of a home as much as he did at the LSE. And I really want to emphasize that part of Harold's intellectual formation. He came to the LSE in 1920. He was appointed by, as you mentioned earlier on, William Beveridge. Crucial to the appointment, however, although Beveridge did not oppose it, there were 3 people crucial to the appointment. One, of course, was really Sidney Webb, who really did make most of the appointments at the time, to be perfectly honest with you. The second person who made a big difference, of course, was one of the great political theorists of the LSE, Graham Wallas, a wonderful writer who wrote some wonderful stuff on human nature and histories of radicalism. The third person, whom I've just written about, by the way, in terms of working on the history of the LSE, is R.B.S. Haldane, one of the great forgotten liberals of the early 20th century, who played a really big role in the early history of the LSE. Who died in 1920. He actually was part of the Labour government in 1924. And Harold Laski was encouraged by all 3 of those to come to the LSE. And let's be perfectly honest, what an impact he made. And for Beveridge, of course, Harold was both a brilliant a brilliant speaker, a brilliant enthusiast, somebody who I think the director of the time found extraordinarily difficult to deal with. And as we know, in the 1930s, there was a little bit of a falling out, let's be perfectly honest, between William Beveridge, who I think was still a great director, and Harold Laski. He became professor of government, because you only had one professor then, of course, in 1926. He succeeded to Graham Wallas. And of course, he remained in that position until 1950. And as I think it's said in the biography of the LSE, in a sense, everybody identified the LSE with Laski. It became a kind of, the LSE is Laski. Now, I'm not sure that was an entirely accurate identification, but he was such a powerful figure at the school. Of course, if you want to look at the full history of the school in the 1930s, also look at Lionel Robbins, also look at Hayek, it was the multiple layers of the LSE, but Laski was such an overwhelmingly dominant figure in the government department. I'll just say three very quick things and then move on to Brant there. One, his fame as a teacher. I mean, I think this is when I taught in Wales, by the way, and the Welsh word for professor is irathro. I don't speak Welsh, but I know those words. Irathro. And what does it mean? Teacher. And I think Laski took that notion of professor as teacher very, very seriously indeed, and inspired so many thousands of students, and particularly those from India, Pakistan, or from the Raj. Ralph Miliband later, who was greatly inspired by Laski, said, it was a gymnastics of the mind going along to a Laski lecture. Kingsley Martin, a later editor of the New Statesman, said his lectures on political theory are brilliant and eloquent. So it's his role as a teacher, the first thing I want to emphasize at the LSE. Secondly, he's a prolific author. Somebody once said if Harold had written 12 books rather than 25, they may have had a long-lasting impact. And I think there's something in that. He wrote all the time, not on everything, but he wrote all the time and probably overwrote, but I still think there are 2 or 3 classics out there, particularly his 1925 Grammar of Politics, which I do think still is well worth a reread. But on India, just to come on to that point before I then hand on to the next speaker, to Brant, it's quite extraordinary how Harold Laski came to India. His life was blighted at the end by a trial, which he lost in the end. It was blighted, and there's no doubt it was a very sad ending to his life, which I think may have accelerated his death. I don't know, but that's certainly implied in some of the biographies. But actually, it was a trial that brought Harold Laski to India, because he was actually asked to go on jury service in 1924 in a trial which really went back to Amritsar and the role of General O'Dwyer. And it was a libel case that had been brought by O'Dwyer or his friends against a man called Mr. Nail, who'd written a book against O'Dwyer, and then a libel case came up. And in that situation, Harold was asked to go on the jury. And I think that was a profound transitional moment in his life. He says that 3 things came out of that trial. One, of course, is that O'Dwyer, in a sense, was vindicated by 12 white men and true. But one who was on that 12 men and true was, by the way, Harold Laski. And he came out of that thinking, there's something profoundly wrong here. And there's a wonderful quote from him. He says, I there discovered the depth of color prejudice. I there discovered the depth of color prejudice within the English ruling elite, within the English system. And he wrote later on to Felix Frankfurt, and he said, the truth is, Felix, we ought not to stay in India. We are not morally fit for the job. And he wrote that in the mid-1920s. And then, of course, in the same year, a year later, he met Krishna and Menon. And Menon immediately said, as he repeated this several times over, Harold Laski became one of us. And once that relationship was established, not just with Menon, with Nehru, and then to a degree also with Gandhi himself, I think, the long-term relationship that he had not only with the LSE in India, not only defined the subsequent history of the LSE and in part the history of India, but also defined the life and times of a very great man called Harold Laski.
Thank you, Mick. And I know we'll return to Mick to sort of reflect back on other contributors as well. But I now want to hand over to Brant Moscovitch, who's going to talk specifically about Harold Laski's relationships with some of those international students. And Brant, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Andrew and Jeanne, and everyone who's been involved in creating this event and who's attending. My familiarity with Laski stems from a curiosity about what caused so many important political and academic figures to develop such close relationships with him, both as students and in many cases long after, and to try to get a sense of the ways in which we might be able to trace Laski's thought and his teaching, the effects of his teaching in the thinking of some of his former students. And it's been mentioned, but I think it bears repeating just the remarkable array of people who studied under him. Jawaharlal Nehru, who wasn't a student per se, but who followed his career quite closely. His cousin B.K. Nehru, who was an important diplomat in his own right. Of course, V.K. Krishna Menon. Ralph Miliband was mentioned in the UK, in Canada. Pierre Trudeau, the former prime minister and father of Canada's current prime minister. So, and that's just a small sampling. It's really incredible how many important historical actors were related to Laski or studied under him. There are a lot of reasons behind Laski's appeal as a teacher, in particular to Indian students. Certainly one of them, one of the most important, was his very vocal support for independence and his work with Krishna Menon and the India League in the 1930s and the 1940s. But the part of the story that I know best is his role as an educator. So that's what I'll focus on for the next couple of minutes. We can actually piece together some of what Laski conveyed in his classes, not only through his own lecture notes, but through the lecture notes that have been left behind by some of the students. And that includes Krishna Menon from the late 1920s, as well as others up into the 30s, and Pierre Trudeau, notably in the 1940s. In addition to the, I think, relatively mainstream teaching on the history of political thought and government that you might expect, there's also a fairly consistent and harsh criticism of capitalism and its relationship to empire and colonialism, as well as the belief that Laski expresses in the near inevitability of for the institutions of political democracy to be hijacked and corrupted, hijacked by vested interests. So these are some of the themes that come out of the student lecture notes, the idea that liberalism and electoral democracy, while great steps forward in the 18th and 19th centuries, and certainly things that must be guaranteed to India, won't by any means guarantee freedom for the individual unless they're supported by a very robust set of economic rights, which of course, for those of you who are familiar with Laski's writings, is a main theme. At the same time that Laski is addressing these themes inside the classroom and outside in India League meetings and elsewhere, I think it's important to recall that in India, there's a parallel and often very much intertwined development from at least the late 1920s with the Motilal Nehru report and various Congress Party sessions, 1931 and others. There's more and more focus on not only of course, the paramount objective, which was securing political freedom, but also on what was an emerging debate about what political freedom actually meant, how political rights related to economic conditions on the ground, and what the idea of economic rights and economic democracy could offer. And this is a space that some in Congress, of course not all, Congress was famously a very big tent organization, but some, and Nehru prime among them, shared, I think, unmistakably with Laski, as well as others, it should be said, on the British left. R.H. Tawney, another important figure at LSE in the 1920s, as well as G.D.H. Cole and others. And there are a lot of examples of this overlap and interplay. Laski's emphasis on economic democracy is cited in numerous memoirs and writings of students. G.L. Mehta and Renuka Ray are two notable examples. There are also many cases where Nehru and Laski use virtually identical language in speeches and writings in the 1930s and 1940s when addressing issues of inequality or democracy, and how essential it was that independence didn't just mean the transfer of power from Britain to wealthy Indians or Indian industrialists. The last point that I'll just briefly raise is which it's already been alluded to, the famous tension in Laski's thought between his Marxism and his liberalism, and which the liberal aspects or pluralist aspects of his thinking, although much more apparent in his earlier writings and his later career, as I think Andrew mentioned, is still very much apparent in his later writings, I would say. And I think one of the most compelling things about him and formed one of the most important parts of his intellectual appeal. I think this tension and attempt at fusion is certainly very apparent in Laski's writings, but also many Indian thinkers and activists at the time. The attempt to balance, on the one hand, the thinking about large-scale government involvement and the enforcement of economic rights that were increasingly seen as necessary to redress deeply ingrained inequities of social, political, and economic inequalities, on the one hand, with a desire on the other to preserve, or in the Indian case, create political freedoms and limits on government authority that were absent from notably the Soviet Union, which was a source of inspiration for Laski, as well as Nehru and others at the time. I guess I'll just, one final point is just, I think it goes without saying, but issues of deeply ingrained inequality, the breakdown or difficulties with political institutions of democracy. I mean, these are very still, I think, relevant themes, and lend credence to the idea that Laski's work is still relevant. So I'll pass it off there.
Well, thank you very much, Brant. And certainly looking at what he did, wrote for the Fabian Society, it was very much in the constitutional space that you talk about, better democracy, and a lot of the themes are still with us to this day. For example, he led work on reform of the House of Lords, which is still unfinished business in the UK. So let me turn to India. So I'm delighted to be joined by Jairam Ramesh, who is the biographer of Krishna and Menon, and is going to talk to us about the intellectual relationship between Laski and Menon. Over to you.
Thank you. Let me take over from where Mick Cox ended. And he said that it was in June 1924 that Laski discovered the depth of color prejudice. And this was just about the time that a colored man named Krishna Menon, a protege of Annie Besant, and a very active member of the Theosophical Society, had just arrived in England. And within a few months of his arrival in England, he and Laski struck up a relationship at the LSE, and Krishna Menon, in the words of Frida Laski, was a chronic student at the LSE. He was registered as a student at the LSE from 1924 to 1934, a record that is unlikely to be equaled, if not better. And this was much to the consternation of William Beveridge, who didn't like this troublemaking Indian, who was always talking about Indian independence. Unlike many other Indian students at the LSE, who came from upper middle class families preparing for the ICS, otherwise part of the Indian ruling establishment, which was comfortable with British rule. But it was really Krishna Menon and Laski from 1925 onwards. For the next 25 years, Krishna Menon was in many ways the closest Indian to Laski, after Laski had developed this great passion for Indian independence after the trial which Dr. Cox spoke about. Now, I'd like to make a couple of points on this. Nehru was not particularly close to Laski, and neither was Gandhi. It was really Krishna Menon, and Krishna Menon alone, who was Laski's interlocutor as far as India was concerned. Through Krishna Menon, he became known to Nehru. Nehru was fond of Laski. Gandhi did not particularly care for Laski, and I'll tell you why that is so. We are all taught to believe that the Indian independence movement was the product of a revolutionary upheaval in the Indian subcontinent, led by various people, most notably Gandhi, after 1920. That's true. But there was a second strand to the Indian freedom movement, which has often not got the attention it deserves, which is that Indian independence was as much a product of an upheaval in India as it was a product of negotiations between the Indian National Congress and different sections of British society, most notably the Labour Party. First, the Independent Labour Party, and later the Labour Party. And in this process of negotiation between the Indian National Congress and the Labour Party, Krishna Menon was a pivotal figure. And because Krishna Menon was a pivotal figure, Laski becomes a crucial figure on the other side. It is around Laski that you have Stafford Cripps, you had Clement Attlee, you have Richard Crossman, and a number of others, left-wing intellectuals who become part of the circle. Incidentally, one other person who's very close to Menon in that period was J.B.S. Haldane, one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, who incidentally gave up British citizenship and came and settled down in India in 1957 and died as an Indian citizen in 1964. Now, what did Laski do in the 1930s and the 1940s for India? Laski was an indefatigable campaigner for the India League, which was started by Annie Besant, really, and then taken forward and given new life and new momentum by Krishna Menon. He wrote pamphlets, he spoke on various forums, he championed the cause of Krishna Menon, and through Laski, Krishna Menon got an entree into different sections of British society. The one section of British society that Krishna Menon was unable to penetrate was the Tory party. He was not close to the Tory party. He was not close to the Conservatives at all. Maybe this was, reflected Laski's own friendship circle and network. But the fact is that it was largely with the British intellectuals, the British artistic class, the British journalists, British academics, but most importantly, the British Labour Party. So I think the most important role that Laski plays, and by the way, when I say Laski, it's Harold Laski and Frida Laski, because Frida Laski is as important to Indian independence in London as Harold Laski was. And also, later on, it turns out that their daughter Diana as well was also very much involved in this process. So the Laskis become these great champions of Indian independence. They come to the India League, they speak week after week, and more important than speaking, Laski writes. He writes pamphlets, he writes notes, he writes letters. And if you were to ask me, what's the single most important contribution that Laski makes to Indian independence, it comes in 1934, when Laski drafts a note called a Constituent Assembly for India. And, the Constituent Assembly idea had been talked about since the 1920s. Motilal Nehru had talked about it, Annie Besant had talked about it, but the first man to give detailed, concrete shape to the idea of a Constituent Assembly was Laski, and Laski and Krishna Menon, I think, did this together, and this was then sent to Nehru. From 1934 to 1939, Gandhi resists the idea of a Constituent Assembly. The idea of a Constituent Assembly doesn't go anywhere because Gandhi is not sold on it. But finally, Gandhi, because of Nehru's persuasions, is able to come around. And then, as you know, the Constituent Assembly meets in December 1946 and then produces this great Constitution of India, of which the architect was another LSE product, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is memorialized in LSE in many ways. So this is his greatest contribution, the idea of a Constituent Assembly. He plugged at it, kept on at it, championed it, wrote about it, and Krishna Menon, of course, became the instrument by which whatever Laski thought and whatever Laski wrote got fed back into the Indian National Congress to Nehru, and through Nehru to Gandhi and all the other colleagues. So to my mind, this idea of a constituent assembly is very important. 24th of June 1938 is a very important date in India's freedom movement, because that's the time in which Nehru and Krishna Menon meet the top echelons of the British Labour Party, Attlee, Crossman, Cripps, Laski. And I have a beautiful photograph in my biography of Krishna Menon of this historic meeting. And it is this meeting that really works out the transfer of power that takes place 9 years later. Of course, in 1938, we are talking of transfer of power to one entity called India. But in 1947, the transfer of power takes place to two dominions, India and Pakistan. That's the only difference between what was discussed in that 1938 meeting, in which, of course, it was hosted by Cripps, but Laski plays a very crucial role. Now, in Laski's funeral, Laski's biographers, Sherman and Kramnik, write that Krishna Menon, who was then the High Commissioner to London, lent a Rolls-Royce car for the funeral. And later on, as Professor Cox said, Harold Laski Society was founded in 1954 in Ahmedabad. And Frida Laski kept in touch with Krishna Menon and in fact came to India along with Isabel Cripps, who also, as Stafford Cripps was very close to Nehru and Krishna Menon. From 1950 to 1964, the apocryphal story was that there was a chair in the cabinet meeting which Nehru took, and that chair was vacant, and that was the Harold Laski chair. But it's a fact that Laski, of course, died in 1950, just when the Indian Planning Commission was being established. So his influence in post-independent India is not that evident. But I would say from 1934 to 1947, he played an absolutely crucial role in making the idea of Indian independence acceptable in British society, in championing the cause of Krishna Menon, who became a one-man army. Of course, Krishna Menon was helped by many young students at the LSE, usually female. So I've called that India League, it was a one-man, many-woman army. And they were really, the patron was Harold Laski, with Frida Laski helping them along. So he plays a crucial role. He was as much a freedom fighter for India like any other man who went to jail in India, or faced the lathis of Indian policemen acting on the orders of British magistrates. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. In the process of writing this book, I discovered many aspects of Harold Laski and his relationship with India particularly. And what amused me most was the absolute frustration of William Beveridge. For 10 years, he could get rid of neither Laski nor Krishna Menon, and he found them a very potent mix. But finally, I think towards the later part, in 1958, one of Krishna Menon's biographers wrote to Beveridge asking him for his recollections of Krishna Menon, and Beveridge wrote back saying that it's been a long time. I have no worthwhile recollections of Krishna Menon. That was a very diplomatic way of getting around a situation where he wouldn't have had very many complimentary things to say about Krishna Menon. So let me end by saying that this was a unique intellectual partnership. It started off as an intellectual partnership. It became a personal relationship involving, as I said, Mrs. Laski, the Laski's daughter, and it became a very crucial part of India's freedom movement. The Fabians play a very important role in India's freedom. I think we should not forget the Quakers, who also played a very important role, and we certainly should not forget the role of the Theosophical Society, which also was very important, particularly in British society, and Annie Besant particularly. So thank you very much.
That's great. Annie Besant, who of course started as a Fabian and then went off to create her Indian connections. So that's fantastic. So we're going to slightly widen the story out and then turn to Jeanne Morefield, who's going to talk about Laski and India's independence.
Oh, thank you. So Nilanjan asked me originally if I would participate in this event because I wrote a piece in 2009 about Laski's critique of the violent, repressive habits of imperialism. And I couldn't agree more that I think that the early discomfort that he had with sovereignty remains there through the very end of his writing and definitely affected his thinking about imperialism. But the truth of the matter is that I would never have written about Harold Laski in the first place, or imperialism in the first place, if not for my advisor, my PhD advisor, Isaac Kramnik, who really sadly, for the world of political theory, died in December of 2019. And in addition to being a hugely influential scholar of political thought and a wonderful person, Kramnik co-wrote the 1993 biography that you guys have referred to, Harold Laski, A Life. And Isaac's affinity for Laski, I think, deserves its own dedicated conference at some point, but suffice it to say there is an extraordinarily strong bond across time between the two men that one feels really viscerally when reading about Laski through Isaac. A bond that I imagine is similar to the intensity of Laski's own relationships with his students and some of the most important figures in the cause for Indian independence. So perhaps not surprisingly then, the last piece that Isaac was in the midst of writing when he died was an essay on Laski's important relationship to the Indian independence movement, which will be published later this year as part of a Fenschrift for Global Krishna Gandhi. And thanks to Isaac's family, what I'm going to do now is present to you an expurgated version of this essay. It's all Isaac's prose, which I have just condensed and lightly edited. So, okay, on that note, now please imagine me as Isaac Kramnik. Harold Laski's interest in India took political shape in the most unpredictable of ways. He was called to jury service. So again, me again. This is, of course, what you guys have already discussed. But for 5 weeks in 1924, and for 5 hours a day, Laski was one of 12 special jurors in the notorious libel case O'Dwyer versus Nair, a trial which reopened the whole Amritsar affair. From the jury box, in an almost unprecedented spectacle, Laski interjected himself with questions and comments to witnesses, counsels, and the judge. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 25 minutes, returned to say that 11 agreed to accept the verdict of the majority except one, Harold Laski. The trial marked the real beginning of Laski's commitment to the cause of Indian independence. Many of the legions of Indian students who came to study with Laski at the LSE did so partly because of this commitment. 30 years later, in 1954, the Foreign Minister of India, Krishna Menon, noted that, quote, since the days that he sat on the jury in the Michael O'Dwyer case, Professor Laski became one of us. Menon knew of what he spoke, for in 1925, he had become a student of Laski's at the LSE, and for 2 decades, while in London, he and Laski collaborated closely. Menon learned his socialism from Laski, and their relationship was much closer than simply that of teacher-student. Laski took a domestic interest in the frail, handsome domestic depression-prone aesthetic who seemed to survive on tea and buns. The two were close political allies and friends for decades. Speaking to the Indian Independence Anniversary celebration in London in 1949, Laski commented, "I do not know how many times I have gone to meetings that I did not want to attend, have made speeches I did not want to make, have written articles I had no time to write, because I was under the grim control of this irrepressible embodiment of the will of India to be free. And I look back, and what I owe Krishna Menon for having made me attend as a member of his army is a debt I can never repay." In MacDonald's 1929 Labor government, Professor Laski, by then an influential figure in the party, served diligently as a foot soldier in Menon's army. India preoccupied MacDonald's government, which made clear that India would someday have dominion status. Gandhi responded by demanding it immediately and began 1930 with a dramatic new campaign of civil disobedience, during which he and 50,000 of his fellow Indians were imprisoned. MacDonald then decided to speed up the process and called the first Indian Roundtable Conference for November 1930, which ended on an optimistic note. However, some of the hopes for an easy settlement were dimmed during the great parliamentary debate on India in 1931 when Churchill announced his implacable opposition to any conciliation of Indian nationalism. When the second Roundtable Conference met later that year, Gandhi attended as the sole representative of the Indian National Congress, and the general talks did not go well, and after the first few weeks, Gandhi resented having come. When the conference broke up in utter failure, Laski described the debacle as the inevitable result of Gandhi's, quote, haunting fear that the white man in India will always take a yard before each inch of compromise. Laski remained an outspoken advocate of Indian independence. He ridiculed what he saw as Churchill's nostalgic fantasy of Victoria's empire. We hold India, Laski wrote, not by the quality of our rule, not by a reciprocal interest born of mutual goodwill. We hold India by the sword. No country is held by goodwill when 50,000 people have to be sent to jail. His commitment to Indian independence was intensified by his relationship with Nehru, who, Laski wrote, wants not merely a political revolution which would free India from foreign domination, he wants also a socialist revolution which would effect a complete change in India's economic system. Laski, however, failed to convince his fellow members of the Labour Party's National Executive Committee to include Indian independence as part of Labour's demand in 1940 for agreeing to join the wartime coalition government. When the British insisted on postponing action on India until the war was over, Nehru and Gandhi and the Indian National Congress turned to civil disobedience, and were jailed. In November 1945, Krishna Menon organized a massive celebration of Nehru's 56th birthday at St. Pancras Town Hall and invited Laski as the principal speaker. Laski's speech, quote, must be considered a landmark in the history of India's struggle for freedom. Every paper in London carried his words. Indian freedom is inevitable and inescapable, and what we have to decide is whether that freedom shall come gracefully by British cooperation or instead by British hostility. We have to make up our minds. A Labour Party which is unwilling to play its full part in the emancipation of India will sooner or later be unwilling to play its full part in the emancipation of the British working class. As a movement that is part of the international movement for human emancipation, a Labour Party which fails this test will pass from the historical scene. For the Indian problem is part of a much wider and more vital issue, the end of imperialism everywhere. The strategy worked, and Labour quickly set in motion the process by which independence was granted to India. Laski, fittingly enough, was the speaker at the London celebration of Indian Independence Day. Laski died on the 24th of March, 1950, 1 month after Labour defeated Churchill for a second time. With his work for independence and his influence on the political elite through Nehru, Menon, and the legions of his LSE students, Laski's reputation in India was widespread. No surprise, then, that Gopal Krishna Gandhi would claim in 1993, quote, in its early years, there was always a vacant chair at every cabinet meeting in India reserved for the ghost of Professor Harold Laski. Okay, breaking the fourth wall, this is me again, not Isaac. What moves me most about this essay is Isaac's description of Laski's openness to the political struggle of others, his appreciation for the cause of Indian independence and the students and friends who brought him along in solidarity, and the way Laski allowed himself to be transformed by anti-colonial arguments, something that was and is rare for many scholars of politics in the universities of the global north. Isaac Kramnik did something similar. He instilled in many of us an impatience with methodological and political borders and an openness to the ideas of others. In my mind, as I read Isaac on Harold, I sometimes have a hard time separating their voices, which I'm assuming would have been just fine with Isaac Kramnik.
Jeanne, thanks so much. And we've got 2 for the price of 1 in terms of our contributors there. And then I'm going to turn to our final presenter, I've lost my place. That is Tejas. Tejas Parasher, and he's going to talk about Indian students at LSE and their relationship with Laski. And I think you're going to do some screen sharing for us. Is that right? Oh, you've given up on that. Go ahead, Tejas.
Great. Can you hear me all right? Great.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure. That was all very fascinating, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this long overdue discussion. I'd like to thank everyone at the LSE, at the Fabian Society for hosting, and particularly want to thank Nilanjan for having organized everything so beautifully and for having been patient with my incessant emailing. So my remarks are going to focus on an exclusively academic aspect of Harold Laski's place in Indian history. I want to say a little bit about the role that many of Laski's ideas, particularly one idea, played in the rise of political science as a new discipline in India in the 1920s. So Harold Laski's second book and his first major work of scholarship was published from New Haven in 1917 with the title Studies in the Problem of Sovereignty. So Laski's intention in this book, which preceded his move to the LSE, was to highlight the inaccuracy, what he saw as the inaccuracy of a core precept of modern political theory, that political life in complex societies necessarily evolved towards the creation of territorially bound, centralized, and bureaucratic states. Laski associated the idea of a gradual development of political systems towards the state most closely with Hegel's philosophy of right from 1820, and then with later generations of neo-Hegelians in Europe, and some of the people that I know Jeanne has written about. But what Laski was criticizing was also the kind of idea that Weber would express in 2 years later. Laski's book instead reconstructed 18th and 19th century English legal debates about the jurisdiction of churches, civil associations, and other public bodies to show that even in supposedly modern Britain, the authority of centralized government had always been a topic of disagreement. Against Hegel, Laski insisted that, quote, "It is no answer to assert the theoretical infallibility of the state to us who possess the record of history." So what I found very interesting and what I want to suggest is that Laski's critique of Hegel in his 1917 book was an extremely critical intellectual resource for the rise of political science as a discipline in India, or at least for one strand of political science as a discipline in India, particularly what we would now call political theory. As we know from a number, from 1925 on, 1920s, a number of Indian students come to the LSE to study with Laski. But what this also parallels is that from 1920 on, within India, a number of Indian social scientists in newly created universities became preoccupied with trying to understand the evolution of government in Indian history. Like the first generation of Indian historians recently studied by Dipesh Chakrabarti and TCA Raghavan, these political scientists had to contend with deeply entrenched colonial narratives, namely that theories about government and popular rule in the subcontinent had not been as sophisticated in Europe as in Europe, since political units had never coalesced into a single powerful all-Indian state, as in France or especially Prussia. In much 19th century thought, the absence of an identifiable national state in Indian history signified a stunted capacity for political evolution, and especially for democracy. So this was the argument made in Hegel's own philosophy of world history, or in James Mill's History of British India from 1817, and then was repeated throughout many other texts in the 19th century. And it was in trying to challenge these deeply entrenched ideas that Indian political scientists turned to Harold Laski. So my story here revolves around two quite forgotten figures, but both of whom were very critical in the emergence of political science as a field in India. The first figure was someone named Beni Prasad from Allahabad. Prasad initially trained to be a historian of the Mughal Empire, and his first book was titled History of Jahangir. Then in 1923, Prasad traveled to England for graduate studies in political science. He worked primarily with Laski and then received a doctorate from the LSE. His thesis under Laski was published in 1928 with the title The State in Ancient India. After the University of Allahabad established its first Department of Civics and Political Science in 1928, Prasad returned to India to become one of the country's first professors of political science. He wrote throughout the 1920s and 1930s, but he died tragically at quite a young age in Allahabad in 1945. The second intellectual figure in my story, and I'll return to Prasad in a second, but the second intellectual figure in my story was named H.N. Sinha. Sinha was also a professor of political science based at Morris College in Nagpur. He arrived at the LSE 4 years after Beni Prasad and also worked under Harold Laski, as well as under Herman Feiner, who was professor of in the Department of Public Administration and was a major authority on parliamentary politics. Feiner later moved to the University of Chicago in 1942 and became a key figure in the rise of comparative politics as a discipline in American political science. But Sinha's dissertation under Laski and Feiner was completed in 1935 and published 3 years later under the title Sovereignty in Ancient Indian Polity. Now, this book is almost entirely forgotten now, but it's a remarkably sophisticated work of what we might call the history of political thought. Both Prasad's The State in Ancient India and Sinha's Sovereignty in Ancient Indian Polity accepted the Hegelian verdict that they had never, in fact, been a properly centralized nation state at any point in Indian history. Prasad, for instance, argued that sovereignty in pre-colonial India was, quote, essentially pluralistic, diffused among myriads of groups, particular jurisdictions and influences. And here he was also drawing on his earlier work on the Mughal Empire. H.N. Sinha likewise argued that no government in pre-modern India had been able to, quote, possess unified control in its sphere of influence. But then both authors went on to insist that the fragmented nature of pre-colonial sovereignty was not a sign of historical or political backwardness. It did not mean that Indian history had lacked a coherent theory of popular government or of democracy. And it was here that Prasad and Sinha turned to their doctoral advisor, Harold Laski's studies in the problem of sovereignty. Given that Laski had shown how the state remained a deeply contested unit of governance in even the most modern European states like Britain and Germany, then one could not justifiably make the claim that a weak state signified a pre-modern or a pre-democratic political community. Citing Laski, Prasad and Sinha argued that Hegel's linking together of state development with modern political and modern democratic rationality was itself fundamentally flawed. So in this sense, Laski's studies in the problem of sovereignty offered the first generation of Indian political scientists and Indian political thinkers who studied under him a counter-argument to the notion that worthwhile ideas about government simply could not have existed in a pre-modern Asian society, given the absence of a properly sovereign state. This was definitely not Laski's intention when he wrote his book in 1917, but it became one of his most striking legacies. So even though Prasad and Sinha have unfortunately become a bit lost to intellectual history, the overriding preoccupation within Indian political theory in the first half of the 20th century is about, did such a thing as democracy exist in pre-colonial India? And it is Laski's point that democracy could have existed and has existed even in the absence of a properly modern centralized state that allows them to make that claim in the affirmative. I'll end there. Thank you.
That's brilliant. And just before I return to Michael, just to remind those of us watching and on the stream that we are very keen to hear your questions, and that you can put those questions to our speakers in the YouTube chat function. So do type in, and I know that Simon is keen to read out questions that you want to submit. But before we do open it up, I just want to go back to Michael, who's very kindly sort of offered to pull the threads together of the conversation we've had so far, and sort of try and sort of sort of bring it all back to the LSE, Laski, and sort of what we've learned about all these interconnected influences that he had on India politics and ideas.
Well, thank you for that almost impossible task, Andrew, after a number of excellent presentations. I'll just pick out 1 or 2 points from each of the presentations. I won't go back over. On the point that Dr. Moscovitch made, I think that's really interesting, the influence. I don't know if you know this one too, you probably do, but also Laski developed relationships with all sorts of people at the LSE in the 1930s. And surprise, surprise, one of them was a family called Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy was, of course, the then US ambassador to the UK, and not a very popular one, given that in 1939 and 40, he was thinking Britain was going to be defeated anyway. But actually, Laski actually taught Joe Kennedy Jr., the one they thought would become president. And later on, and he was quite influenced by Laski, although, of course, what Joe Kennedy Sr. said was, you've got to study with the enemy in order to actually combat them better. That was a kind of a Joe Kennedy approach, which was quite interesting. Actually, too, Joe Kennedy had a kind of sneaky admiration for Laski, who he didn't like ideologically. And so one day, and again, this comes out in Kramnik, Parasher, the Sherman biography, which I agree with Jeanne, is absolutely fantastic book, by the way. It is one of the great biographies, I have to admit. It's absolutely terrific stuff. It's written with such passion and it's so eloquent, and it's not entirely uncritical. I think it's a fantastic book. But there's a point where Joe Kennedy Sr. Goes to Laski and says, my son, this is now John Kennedy, JF, has written this book, While England Slept. And what do you think of it? You know, this actually was later published, of course, as a John Kennedy's book. And Laski, typically honest and open and straightforward, unlike, I suppose, many of us today, who always try and keep our opinions sometimes to ourselves a bit more. He said, it's a terrible book. I wouldn't publish it. It's so poor. But the point is, why did the Kennedys, even they kind of saw somebody like Laski as somebody you needed to talk to and engage with and discuss? And I think, again, that gets back maybe to the frustrations of Beveridge, which I think we've all mentioned. You know, whatever that people may have thought of his ideology and his politics, Laski was such a humane human being, if I can put it like that, that he was open to everybody. He was open to everybody, whether or not you agreed with him or not. The one point I would take out, we didn't discuss it enough, maybe, very, very big, were his attitudes towards the Soviet Union, which inevitably was bound to come up as what was the left in the 1930s. Now, we do know that our founders, the two Webbs, literally did go over to the Soviet side almost completely in their book on the Soviet Union civilization in 1936. Almost uncritical, it has to be said. I think what is interesting about Laski, although he wanted to emphasize Soviet economic achievements, and he wanted to emphasize the Soviet role in the struggle against Nazi Germany, perfectly valid positions to take, in my view, both on the economic achievements, as it was seen from the outside, and of course, in terms of the battle against Nazi Germany. Laski never went the full way. He never went as far as the Webbs when it came to this. And I think this gets back to his theory of pluralism. You know, I think the thing that was mentioned earlier on by one or two of the other speakers, I think that really made it very difficult for him, because he was still committed, of course, to political democracy and to political pluralism. It meant, therefore, that while he recognized the achievements and the international role of the USSR, unlike the Webbs, I think he didn't buy into the whole thing. And the Soviets later on, by the way, were very, very critical of him towards the end of his life. On the wonderful comments by Ramesh, I think that's fantastic. By the way, J.B.S. Haldane, the scientist and communist, went to India, if I remember, as a protest against the Suez invasion of 1956, and said, I'm not sticking around in this country any longer. I've had enough. So off he went to India. But I think what's so important about what you said, if I could say, Jared, is the following. There's so much emphasis on the process of India, the final independence and partition, but there's so much emphasis on that on Mountbatten. I mean, you can't move without Mountbatten not getting in the way, but you know what I'm trying to say. You know, films have been made about him. You know, we had book after book after book about Mountbatten, entirely legitimate. But somehow or another, the Labour Party, which you bring back in to the narrative, seems to get taken out of that narrative as well. And I think the points that you made were so important of bringing the Labour Party and Laski within the Labour Party really back central to that narrative and that debate. And also, of course, I'm sure you know this as well as I do, in 1912, through money donated by the Tata Foundation to the LSE in 1912, they created, of course, the Tata Institute at the LSE on social policy, and one of the lecturers at that was none other than Clement Attlee. And, you know, so the connection is also made back to 1945. I keep saying to myself, and I've said this to my good friend, I'm sure you know, Ramachandra Guha, thank goodness the Labour Party won in 1945 and not the Conservatives. Not only did we get a National Health Service as a result, we also at least got some possibilities, however tragic and costly, of Indian independence. Just imagine if Churchill had been in control in 1945. You know, I kind of do wonder about what the real consequences may have been. But again, thank you for your great comments. And thank you also, by the way, for re-emphasizing Frida's role in this and Annie Besant. You know, I mean, there's very many points there which I think really do need to be taken on. Krishna Menon, about which you know a very great deal. I've actually been following how often the MI5 followed Krishna Menon. They seem to have about 4 people following him all over London, reading his mail and listening to his telephone calls all the time. They clearly regarded him as a pro-communist influence. So the British security services had some very grave doubts about Krishna Menon, as I'm sure you are well aware, as indeed they did about Harold Laski as well. Jeanne, thank you so much for bringing that wonder Isaac back into. I never met him. I wish I had, but I only emphasize yet again that I think that is a great. I'm not just saying it because you think it's a great, and you knew him, but I just think it is such a wonderful book. And I do think the one thing I took out of it, which I meant many things I took out of it, but it's that the tale of 2 trials in Laski's life. I find kind of extraordinary, really. You know, he gets radicalized, drawn into understanding India through that trial in 1924, and then his life is blighted by that libel case which he took, probably unwisely, to be perfectly honest. I don't know. And I think his life was, you know, both accelerated by the first and in a sense, not compromised, but I think, you know, I think it undermined him a bit, and didn't, but I don't know. It's kind of that issue, the serendipity in life. You know, he's called to jury service in 24, you know, and he takes a libel case, much against the advice of all of his friends in 45. And I think that's a very sad, it's not a sad end to his life, but one gets the impression from the biography that it had an impact on him. And although he still remained very influential in the Labour Party and many other things, I think that is something. On Tejas, thank you so much, Tejas. I mean, you know, we know so much about the stories of Indian students from the empire, the Raj, essentially, and how many, you know, one of the first presidents of the Students' Union, I think 1912, was an Indian student. Somebody's mentioned Ambedkar, who studied at the LSE and did his PhD there in 1922-23 on the rupee, which, by the way, was referred and then subsequently accepted. And of course, the great role that Ambedkar played in India, the Constitution. And Ambedkar, one of the great books I read when I was a young radical student, maybe I'm an old radical student now, Simon, was the wonderful book he wrote on caste, class and race. That fantastic book on caste, which I still think is one of the great classics. I'm not sure of Indian political science, but it's such a fantastic book, I think, written by Ambedkar in 1934. And I think that's an extraordinarily important book, I think, in Indian bibliography. And I think it's one that Gandhi himself had some problems with as well, Jairam as well. On the other thing, I'd just make a wider point, adding to your point, Tejas, and this is, in a sense, a bit of you know, publicity for the LSE, not that it really needs it, but it's extraordinary to see how global the LSE was generally in the interwar period, and indeed today. I mean, I think what the numbers of Indian students at the LSE demonstrate to me is what the LSE was more generally, globally. And that's not just a word. It's not just a, you know, a slogan we can stick on a, you know, in a way that some people love, all global. It was actually true. You know, I've been through every annual report of the LSE in the interwar period, just to take that period. And it's not just Indians, it's students from Japan, students from China, students increasingly from the United States. You know, the foundation of anthropology in China starts with Malinowski's lectures in anthropology. You know, a banker's son, here's a story for you, another American story, very briefly. I know we're talking about India. A banker's son comes to the LSE and suddenly discovers all these kind of ideas floating around in 31. His name became Paul Sweezy. Paul Sweezy went back to the United States, became a Marxist, partly as a result of his influences in going to Laski's lecture, and founds the Monthly Review, a very left-wing magazine, in 1949. So there's so many interesting people coming through, and it's so remarkable. And it's also, and I'll end on this point, it is a remarkable statement about the vision of the founders, if I can go back to that. You know, I mean, it's just here you go, 4 people, Graham Wallis, G.B. Shaw, who, of course, being G.B. Shaw, immediately writes a critique of the LSE, being G.B. Shaw, you know, and the 2 Webbs, you know, almost with nothing in their pocket except a few £1,000 donated by Henry Hutchinson. And by the 1930s, you know, it's established itself as this extraordinary institution, really unique, not just in London or unique in the UK, but actually unique in the world. And I think it does say something about the great vision of the founders and what they they managed to create. And I suppose I'm bound to end on this, Simon. Long may it continue. Long may it continue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. And we will pass back to Simon on that note.
Yeah, I mean, there's questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to put them to the group. But I wanted to first make a few comments. I mean, I came to LSE in 1987 as an undergraduate student and have been associated with it on and off since then. I've been on the faculty since the mid-90s. So, and I bought, if you give me one sec. Covered in dust. Bought the
Very good.
and Shearman biography. I remember in 1993 as a master's student at LSE, and didn't know that I, of course, would then become the Harold Laski Professor for my life. Mick, I don't know if you were there when we went to the 70th anniversary of the LSE's evacuation to Cambridge. So
yeah, I was at that wonderful event up there. Yeah, it's a Peterhouse.
It was a fantastic event, and it reminded me very much of what you were saying about how, you know, Peterhouse College at Cambridge was just about the most English establishment college you could imagine. It was all male, it was all white, and here comes LSE, and LSE is invited into the college. These men had never met women who were academics before, and they'd never hardly met anybody of a different color or race. And here comes LSE was a complete explosion for them and fundamentally transformative. Yeah. And the comments we heard about how this was, you know, they'd never really realized there was an intellectual life outside this very narrow circle. And it was a transformative experience for Cambridge, and transformative experience, I think, for the British sort of educational establishment. I had another comment about, and some interesting things you were saying there, Tejas, about political science. One of my passions is historiography of political science, and it is interesting the point, Mick, you made about how these days Harold would not have thought of himself as a political scientist. But if we think back to the 1920s and 30s, actually, political science, the science bit was actually progressive. The whole point about calling the LSE the London School of Economics and Political Science was to break away from the idea that there couldn't be a science of politics, or there couldn't be a science. By studying things systematically, we could find the truth of things. You could collect evidence, collect data, analyze that data. And Harold Laski was a great believer in empiricism as well as political theory. And so he was part of that new modern tradition. The irony was he was then replaced by Oakeshott. And it was Oakeshott who was opposed to the idea of a science of politics. In fact, the reason association in the UK, or Science Association, is because Michael Oakeshott, at the very first meeting of the association, and said, there's no such thing as a science of politics. We have to be called a political studies association. And it was a conservative backlash against the lefty scientists. He saw it. And so that whole interwar period of the science of politics was a left-wing progressive movement against an establishment that said, no, we can't study the social world or the political world in a scientific way because we already know what the answers are. And so I think in that period, he was part of a very progressive movement that moved to think very systematically about the political world in a way that was the antithesis to the sort of established way of doing it. I then actually had a question to all of you who know much more about the history and foundation of India. So you've talked about his role in thinking about sovereignty, making the case for a sort of liberal or even Marxist conception of sovereignty and independence, anti-imperialism. But was there also a legacy of Laski and the Fabians, and also the Indian leadership and their experience in India on actually the foundation of the state and what was rented moving forward? In a way to a lot of the sort of Western states, it was a social democratic state in its foundations and in its aspirations. So I wonder if any of you have got anything to say about those sort of foundational years of the Indian legacy that Harold and Krishna, Menon and some of those other foundational leaders played in that moment.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked that, Simon, because obviously I made that good point in my opening remarks. It'd be fantastic to talk about sort of the early post-independence years. Who would like to kick off on that? Tejas, I can see your hand, and others do raise your hand.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. I also had a point about what you said earlier, Simon, about political science as a science, but I'll come back to that later. So just on this point about the early years of the post-independent state, one of the really interesting ways in which the Fabians have a legacy is in terms of the system of caste reservations in the Indian Constitution. So Ambedkar's states and minorities, which was his draft constitution prepared on to submitted to the Constituent Assembly, drew directly on R.H. Tawney to argue that economic, a socially disadvantaged group is not in a condition to be free unless the state fundamentally intervenes to restructure social conditions. And there's a whole history of Ambedkar referring to Harold Laski and other figures, particularly Laski's Grammar of Politics and Liberty in the Modern State, in order to make these kinds of arguments that an individual who is situated in a dominating society cannot be free on their own. Some political entity has to intervene to reconstruct that society. So I'm not saying that that reservations were necessarily modeled on Fabian policies, but they were justified with references to Fabian ideas about liberty being impossible in an instance of social domination. So there's a very tangible political legacy that goes beyond the kind of standard centralized planning state that I think was diffused throughout the rest of the world. I also wanted to just mention what the point you said about political science as a science and that in itself being a statement. One of the most remarkable things I found about the early decades of Indian political science is how obsessed everyone is with collecting data, as much data as possible. This includes historical data, social scientific data. People go out and do surveys all the time. I mean, but it is making a statement. It's a statement. It's a statement against colonial assumptions that societies are just the way they are. Without doing much kind of empirical work to back up that claim, or much historical work to back up that claim. So I do think that there's a bit of Laski's influence there as well. I mean, that social science in a situation where established narratives are not being questioned, empirical research itself is doing empirical research itself is making a statement in some sense. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to comment on Simon's question?
Well, I think, one shouldn't overestimate the influence of the Fabians and Laski on Indian thinking. It was one strand of thinking, and it was a strand confined to Nehru and Krishna Menon. There were multiple strands. There was a stream that was heavily influenced by the Japanese experience of economic transformation. There was one strand which was definitely wanting allegiance to the Soviet first plan model, which was then very much in the air. And then, of course, there was a Gandhian strand, which was a unique strand, But there was a very small strand of Nehru, of Krishna Menon, and a very small group called the Congress Socialist Party, which formed in the mid-30s, in 1934. But subsequently, of course, they all left the Congress and they formed different socialist parties. So it was a very small group. And I think one shouldn't overestimate the influence of Fabianism and Laski's thought. I think their importance lay in the fact that they provide connections to the India League and to Nehru, to British society. And Nehru often spoke about his fascination for Fabian socialism, and so did Krishna Menon. I think the most important aspect, I would say, the economics is less important. It's the politics that is more important. I think the commitment to a political democracy, the commitment to a representative democracy, the commitment to a constituent assembly that will chart out an independent constitution. Remember, Laski comes onto the scene when the debate in India shifts from dominion status to full independence. And this was a profound shift. It almost split the Congress party. The older generation was for a dominion status and the younger generation was for full independence. And Gandhi was ambivalent as usual. So, there are influences, but I think one shouldn't look for formal influence. There are also informal networks of influence. And I think Laski and the Fabian socialism, the Fabian socialists, played an important role in molding the thinking of a few leaders who became crucial to this negotiations between the Indian National Congress and the British Labour Party. And I entirely agree with Dr. Cox. Mountbatten as a larger than life figure, but actually the contours of the transition had been worked out under Wavell, whom I like, and had been worked out under Linlithgow, whom I completely dislike. But the fact of the matter is, Linlithgow was Viceroy for 7 years. And large part of the transition for which Mountbatten gets credit was actually done during the Linlithgow years and during the Wavell years. Mountbatten had brilliant PR. Alan Campbell Johnson really made a legend out of Mountbatten.
He also had a very influential wife as well, I think.
Yes, yes. Who had a very influential friend in Nehru. So.
I'll just maybe jump in and add to one of Dr. Ramesh's points about many strands of thought making up Indian thinking at this time. Laski, in some small cases, was actually drawn on to argue against many of the things that Laski advocated for. And Dr. Ramesh mentioned the Congress Socialist Party, which was partly founded by another Laski student, Minu Masani, who was a fervent socialist in the 1930s, and I think into the 1940s. By the late 1940s, he turns. In 1950, he founds Freedom First, I believe in Bombay, which was a magazine advocating liberal ideas. And later on in the 1950s, helps found the Swatantra Party, which is an opposition party. It was an opposition party to Congress, again advocating for liberal ideas. And Masani drew on Laski as a kind of a bogeyman, arguing against, in some cases, maybe making straw man arguments, but using him to argue against socialistic policies. So there are many, many strands.
That's great.
Andrew, there are some questions in the chat. If there are some questions in the chat, if others don't want to come in. So the first question that we had from the YouTube channel, Laski was vocally asking for a revolution, which alienated him from both Churchill and even from the Labour Party. How did this idea work alongside Gandhi's non-violence? How did the likes of Menon and Beni Prasad, the Mughal historian that Tejas spoke about, square with Gandhi's advocacy of non-violence? So, was there a tension at the heart of non-violence and Laski's idea of a sort of revolutionary moment?
If I could just jump in quickly before, I'll be very brief on this. By the way, on the question about data, which we talked about in terms of political science, if you want more data-driven Fabians, please go back and read the early webs. I mean, if anybody did data more than the webs, please name who they are, because that is stuff. And if you look at their 1923 book on methodology and social, so that does come back to Simon's point, which is a very interesting one, and yours, Tejas, as well. Well, I don't quite know how to kind of pick that question up again. When the second trial in which Laski was involved revolved around the question of revolution. And he kind of denied that what he meant was violent revolution. And you're looking at Laski himself. Look, he's no V.I. Lenin. He's not a Leon Trotsky. He's not a communist revolution. Indeed, he's not a communist, although he had a lot of close communist friends, including, by the way, Ranji Palm Dutt, who, wrote quite a lot on India. But he wasn't a communist, and he wasn't a Marxist revolution. And I think what he meant by revolution was simply an upheaval in the social order. I think he would have preferred and actually advocated that to come about through constitutional means. I think that's what he meant by revolution. Of course, once you start using a word like revolution, it's going to get picked up. And then, of course, that's what happened with that last part of his life in the libel trial. That's what I understand it to mean. Maybe others have got a different view, and also maybe to bring in the Indian side of it as well.
Tejas.
I just want to add on to that I don't think revolution is always violent revolution. I mean, the term, we think of it as but the sense in which many Indians thinkers understand Laski's references to revolution is something like social revolution, economic I mean, these needn't be violent. They can be, as the Soviet Union showed, but there's no intrinsic link between carrying out a kind of transformation of an unequal society and violence. In this sense, I think Gandhi is also a revolutionary, right? He's not a Leninist, but he does want to revolutionize society and revolutionize the self. So I don't think that someone like Beni Prasad or many others actually had that much trouble squaring ideas about social revolution and commitments to nonviolence.
And at the same time, he was still carrying out that incredibly technocratic work, or sponsoring it for the Fabians and the Labour Party. There's an ambivalence there. Jeanne, you want to come in?
No, I just want to say, I also think there was a lot of bad faith casting of Laski as a sort of revolutionary communist. And you can see this in places like Carl Schmitt's portrayal of Laski in the concept of the political, where he says, all of this stuff that he said about sovereignty, no, he really just wanted a world revolution and to dominate. I mean, so I think this starts really early on with Laski, which is people trying to make him what he wasn't, which was some kind of explicit revolutionary communist, and he wasn't. He was more complicated than that.
And that's where the Cold War comes in, Jeanne, I think.
Although Schmitt wrote that in 1932, so
yeah, but Schmitt wrote a lot of things too. But I think that's where, yeah, absolutely right. He wrote a lot of things which I wish he hadn't. But in the 1950s, I think it is the Cold War which then brings about, I think, much of the misunderstandings and distortions of Laski's writings. That's all. Sorry, I interrupted. I beg your pardon.
I think if you're talking about influences, as I said, in terms of economic influences and what happens in India in the 50s and 60s, I would say Nye Bevan and Stafford Cripps are far more crucial than Laski. Laski is important, as I said, for the democracy aspect of planning. The fact that Nehru and Krishna Menon both were democratic socialists. They were Democrats first and socialists later. The democratic part of their personality, I think, was influenced quite heavily by Laski. The socialist part was more from Cripps and certainly by Nye Bevan. Bevan plays a very important role. And what the Labour government does from 1945 to 1950 has a profound impact, not just in the UK, but it has a very profound impact on economic policy in India. And one phrase of the Fabian Society, the commanding heights. The commanding heights is not just commanding heights in the UK, it's also commanding heights in India. So I think we should distinguish the political influence from the economic influence when we talk about Laski.
Simon, should we go back to you and your questions?
Yeah, so there's a few other questions that came in. The next one relates to some things you've already touched on already. A point elaborated upon was Laski's connection with V.K. Menon as well as Nehru and his cohort. But was there also interaction with a larger socialist and communist circles in India? I mean, how much was there interaction beyond that small cohort? You've touched on this, but was it a broader influence, or was it just amongst that?
It was actually not a very broad influence, Simon. It was an influence almost exclusively. Krishna Menon was a very insecure man, and he wouldn't like to share Laski with anybody else. And he made sure no other Indians came close to Laski. There were 5 other organizations fighting for India's freedom in London. And the India League became the preeminent one because Nehru's imprimatur was on the India League, and the others did not have the same type of influence. And Laski attended every meeting of the India League. He didn't attend the meetings of any other Indian organizations. So Krishna Menon monopolized him and made sure that Laski was not available to anybody else. So his influence was really through the India League, through Nehru, through Krishna Menon in London, and through Nehru in Delhi. So it was a very narrow channel of influence. It was not a widespread channel of influence, but he was known in India. The Congress Socialists looked up to him. People asked him for articles for Indian publications. Laski was like George Bernard Shaw was one of the most famous Britishers in India of that time. Laski was, and the fact that he was at the London School of Economics, many Indians had studied there. Minu Masani was mentioned, although Minu Masani went from being left to the extreme right. And there was another man like Minu Masani, Michael Straight, who wrote his autobiography. He was actually a member of the Communist Party while he was in the LSE. And then it turned out that he was a spy, in the 50s. So, but his influence, to answer your question, Simon, it was a very narrow channel of influence. It was not a broad-based channel.
So it's interesting. I was going to actually follow up with that question, I guess, to Mick and also to others on the panel, which is about the general influence of being educated abroad, and particularly being educated at LSE. LSE was one of the few places that was open to students from the rest of the world. And of course, it wasn't just India, it was other parts of what was then the empire as well. And the generations that went back and founded and worked in the civil service or set up political parties or got involved in the private sector as well. I mean, was there a sense of a community coming back from being educated in Britain? And was there a particular role of LSE as opposed to, say, Oxford and Cambridge at that time?
Well, I'm bound to have a bit of a prejudice on this one, as you may have gathered, Simon, given I've been researching the history of LSE for some time. I actually do think Fabianism, in the broad sense, did exert a pretty general influence in what becomes called the Third World. Yeah. And you can see why, because it emphasizes two or three obvious things, and not just for India, obviously. It emphasizes the role of the state. So that's going to be rather crucial in a new state being formed. Post-colonial states are going to be statist. Secondly, it emphasizes issues such as a new social contract, going back to Tejas's point. The social contract can't just be political or legal or simply based on notions of human rights. It has to be social and economic rights. And also, of course, it has to address the questions of fundamental inequalities and poverty. So all of those things actually does make Fabianism, it's not a script you can just stick on, it's not a blueprint, but it clearly does appeal to a fairly large number of emerging third world leaders who are A, anti-imperial, B, broadly speaking, I mean it in a loose sense, broadly speaking, don't believe the market can deliver on development. And here I do think also the influence of the Soviet Union was also not insignificant, going back to the point that Jairam is making. It may not be that anybody wanted to reproduce communism in India, and only the Communist Party did, and then that split all over the place. It is that they saw Soviet economic planning, and I would get back to the economics on this, as something which had overcome underdevelopment. They kind of saw the Soviet Union as a backward country in 1928, which by 1945 had defeated Nazi Germany and had industrialized. And I think that was a great appeal. And in a way that also, I think, merged into certain kinds of left-wing socialist economic thinking, which I'd call third worldist, and to some degree Fabianism. Actually, there's an interesting connection too, Simon. I can go into this in more detail. And Fabianism and the Soviet Union is quite interesting too, because the Webbs later on did say, and I won't quote verbatim, said something like, well, what they've got in the Soviet Union, ignoring the show trials and everything else for the moment, is kind of form of Fabianism. Now think about that just for the moment. So, but I do think that influence is very broad. Yes, I think it is very broad. And I always come back to this, Simon. How was it this place which was established with so little resources, evening students within 25, 30, 40 years has become, in a sense, a world center, and is attracting actually very distinct kinds of students towards it as well. And I think that is also interesting. The Cambridge experience for Peterhouse must have been a total shock, particularly given that Cambridge didn't even award degrees to women until 1948. Let me remind you. So, this was a kind of a really, it is an extraordinary story, really, I think still. I mean, I take Jairam's point about it only being one strand, but how this very small, rather cramped place, off Aldwych can end up exerting the kind of influence that it does globally. I think it's a remarkable story. Yeah,
I think there's a particular period there that's particularly. Yeah. I remember visiting Israel, and I was involved in some things on the reform of the Israeli constitution, And there was an older generation there of professors in their 70s who said they described the LSE used to be known in Israel in the 1960s and 70s as the London School of Economics. Because it was the first place that allowed Jewish students to study, and had they noticed that Harold Laski was a Jewish professor. My wife is Jewish. My father-in-law, American, in 1959 went from the United States to the LSE, and the reason he went to the LSE when he was doing his sort of junior year abroad from studying in the US was his perception was that the LSE would be accepting and opening to Jewish students, whereas if he went to Oxford and Cambridge, they wouldn't be. And I think that was still, the LSE was still thought of as this open pluralist place, no matter what your background was, and I think that was a really powerful legacy, because a lot of these people came and then went off to other parts of the world and took that with them. So of course, there's many influences on the world. Of course there are, but I am also like you, Mick. I'm very proud of some of the more liberalizing elements, impact we've had in the world when it comes to empire, when it comes to liberal values and so on.
You know, 2 years ago, I wrote a biography of another LSE alumnus, P.N. Huxer, who was India's most influential civil servant. And in that, he writes, he was Malinowski's student at the LSE. His class consisted of a large number of people who went on to become Jomo Kenyatta, for example, was his classmate, who studied with Malinowski. And there are a large number of others. So there's no question that the LSE was an incubator for people who went back to their home countries, some of whom became communists, some of them who became socialists. And it's an interesting question that you've raised. When I'm just thinking, upper middle class Indians, either they went to Oxford, Cambridge, or the LSE. The science guys all went to Cambridge. And so if you look at the top generation of Indian scientists, they were all Cambridge returned. If you look at all the top generation, the early generation of Indian civil servants, they're all Oxford returned. But if you look at all the economists, the political leaders, the socialist thinkers, they're all from LSE. It's an interesting question.
Including Nicholas Caldor. Nicholas Caldor also mentioned that. Sorry.
Jeanne, you wanted to come in.
No, I mean, I think it's so interesting to think about this in terms of influences of the LSE on Indian thinkers and Indian politicians. And I think what's so profoundly interesting about reading about Laski's relationship with Menon is just how much he changed and was deeply affected by his Indian students. And so that, I think that one quotation where he says, I cannot tell you the number of times I've done stuff I didn't want to do. I mean, I can totally relate to that quote, right? Because it's also like, oh my God, do you want me to give another page? Whatever, right? And the way then ends by saying, thank you for making me do this because it changed like me and my thought. And so I think I think thinking about this in symbiotic terms, in terms of what the LSE has brought to the world and what the world has brought to the LSE is kind of important.
Tejas.
I mean, on this point as well, I think we need to really take the term third world very seriously. That being part of the third world was a statement, because it was literally in the context of the Cold War, it was a third way. Framed as a third way. And I think part of the appeal of Fabianism is that it did offer a third way. Perhaps not for the Webs, I mean, because they did have a, perhaps a more uncritical stance towards the Soviet Union. But when I come across Fabian references in Indian writers who are clearly socialists, I always get the sense that they're making these references in order to distinguish themselves from Soviet excesses of Soviet communism. That Fabianism offers them similar theories about social and economic reconstruction, but is not imbued with the excess baggage of Leninism and Stalinism. Really, I think that they are very conscious of that. So when you see these references, there is a sense that as the excesses of the Stalinist state become increasingly clear also through the 1940s, as more information becomes available, I think Fabianism becomes increasingly attractive to this group.
So Tejas, there was a final question, and then I'm going to ask you guys to wrap up. But this was specifically to you, Tejas, which was, could you mention again the key books you mentioned of Sinha and Prasad? And so maybe Nilanjan can take a note of those, or you can send them to him and we can put them up somewhere.
Yes, so the first the book, I can probably send it to Nilanjan and he can maybe send it on. So the first book that I mentioned is by Beni Prasad. It's called The State in Ancient India. And the second is Sovereignty in Ancient Indian Polity. Sovereignty in Ancient Indian Polity in particular is very directly modeled on Laski's second book. Even the title echoes Laski.
So Andrew, I think at this stage, perhaps we ask everybody to just do a sort of final couple-minute roundup of any final thoughts or comments that they have. So,
yes, just my 10 seconds worth is the conversation we just had about Fabianism. I think is also very relevant that people looked back at this period and described it as Fabian. So, you know, even if it wasn't self-consciously at the time, it certainly became a narrative for, you know, sort of how people related to it as a previous historical period. And actually that, I think, has affected how people see the Fabian tradition going forward as well. That when we're criticised, it's often our association with this period and, as you say, the sort of Fabianism as an intermediate between Western market approaches and communism. So let me ask everyone to sum up. I'm going to, in a very random way, go round. I'm going to start off with Jairam.
Well, you know, writing this book on Krishna Menon, I was struck by the fact, extraordinary influence that British trade unions played in making the idea of Indian independence acceptable in British society. That's something that we do not give adequate credit for. The role of British trade unions, the role of women's clubs, the number of meetings that Laski and Krishna Menon addressed women's clubs across the country with 10 women, 15 women, 20 women. And there was a time when Krishna Menon would attend only women's clubs meetings. And, you know, the wives of all the leading British political figures were members of these clubs. And so that's one way in which the idea of Indian independence became, you know, I'm now talking of the 1930s and 1940s, when the Labour Party had not made a full independence for India, still part of their party ideology. And as I mentioned earlier, there are these organizations, the Quakers. Of course, the Quakers are very important as far as Gandhi is concerned, and that's been studied. But the Theosophical Society is an organization that has not got the full attention it deserves. And certainly Annie Besant, a very charismatic figure, and the most influential Indian political figure before Gandhi becomes numero uno in December 1920 is Annie Besant, who's running the Indian freedom movement. And every Indian, you name it, had become a theosophist. So there are these British organizations which are absolutely crucial. And I think the study of Laski, the study of people like Mr. Krishna Menon, certainly educated me much more on that period of British political and intellectual life, which played a foundational role in making the idea of India acceptable, the independence for India acceptable. And I think that's a very important contribution.
Thank you so much, Jairam. Brant, over to you for your last remarks.
Just sorry, had to unmute myself. Yeah, I think that we've talked a lot about students coming to the LSE and to London and then going back. Of course, one of the famous examples of someone who I think, as Jairam said, Krishna Menon came for 6 months and ended up staying for 20 years. He wasn't the only one. There were others who stayed and also had a profound effect on life and academics in London and in Britain. And we mentioned the LSE's influence on what became known as the Third World. And one of the famous students who came and stayed before eventually going to America was Arthur Lewis, who was a very influential economist, wrote on international economic development. He was at the LSE, I believe, in the 1930s. Ended up teaching at the LSE. I think he was the first Black lecturer at the LSE. Stayed in Britain for some years before eventually going on to Princeton. So there's that flow as well.
Great, thank you. Jeanne.
Thanks. You know, one of the things that I find so powerful about Laski's involvement with, well, just questions of imperialism in general, sort of came out in that speech where he said to the Labour Party, look, if you're not actively engaged in confronting, embedded in thinking about imperialism and the anti-imperial struggle, you are not doing what you need to do for the British working class, and you're not doing what you need to do for the liberation of people in general. And he was really clear about integrating what was going on in empire and what was going on in Britain. You know, I came to this country 2 years ago and started teaching a class on race, empire, and modern political theory, and my students routinely tell me that they have learned more about the British Empire in 3 weeks than they learned in the entirety of their secondary school career, which makes me think nobody listened to Laski. Like the Labour Party should have listened closer to Laski. Like that, those questions now that are emerging about Brexit, about immigration, about empire, about statues, all of this stuff should be a part of the way that people in this country, and well, you know, I'm American, so I have my other issues of integrating the past, but should be present. And I think Laski gave us a way of integrating those worlds, and we should listen to him.
Yeah, and at the same time, there were lots of Fabians still focused on enlightened colonial administration. So it was sort of, you know, there were so many strands on the left at that time. Tejas, to you.
Yeah, I was in looking into this material, I've really been struck by how Laski's ideas and Fabianism, however we define it broadly, offered a kind of interpretive tool for Indian thinkers, as much as it offered political and economic models. And we've talked about some of these things. But something I really find remarkable is the first quarter and the first half of the 20th century are a time when the Indian past is just open. All these new resources have become available, and there are so many competing interpretations about what this means. And it's really interesting that so many figures turn to Laski's ideas to give them tools to understand. You know, how do you understand inequality in Indian society? How do you understand democracy? I mean, these are really, I mean, we still haven't settled these questions, but these are really pressing questions for this first generation of social scientists and historians who are just faced with this deluge of new material. And so what I wanted to just leave you with is this idea that Fabianism and Laski's ideas did not just provide models of state building, of economic reform, but actually fund more deeply ways to understand society, ways to understand history.
Thanks, Tejas. And Mick, back to you. Well, so much to say, but not enough time to say it in, but I'll be brief. One other source I would suggest that everybody looks at too, thinking about the relationship of LSE to India, just to keep focused in on that, is two things. One, firstly, go back to Ambedkar as well, because he was influenced, there's no doubt. And I think it's very important, when Ambedkar helped write the Constitution, he made it quite clear, and I think I got this right, Ramesh, that it should not be a socialist constitution, it should be a constitution based on pluralism, political rights. And I think one of the reasons why the Constitution has endured so well within India and been so important to the preservation of Indian democracy goes back to that. And that separating of the political from the economic, I think, was absolutely crucial. And Ambedkar's role in that, of course, was absolutely critical. So I want to bring in Ambedkar into this story, and there's no way that could be. I'd also like to bring in Rajan Tata into this story. You know, and it was through the Webbs who visited India in 1911, and they met Rajan Tata. And then, of course, from that social policy, isn't it ironic, funded by an Indian millionaire, you know, founded the social policy department here in a way which then established an extraordinary long tradition at the LSE, going through to people like Titmuss. But always remember, Attlee was there. So was R.H. Tawney. So some of the great people who came into the school Tawny especially, I wish we could have said a little bit more about him, you know, came in through that particular door made possible by the Tata Foundation. The third thing I'd simply say is please go and read the Webb's diaries their Indian diaries for 1911. They are fascinating. They are absolutely fascinating in terms of this attitude. And it can't be summarized in one sentence, Andrew, really. Their disdain for British political administration knows no bounds. They just can't find one British administrator, except at the very lowest level, who are any good. They kind of think the people running this country, which was part of central part of empire, really don't know what they're doing, have nothing to do with the ordinary Indian people, and are simply separated from them. On the other hand, they contain within them, and this in a sense is the ambiguity of Fabianism, maybe, Andrew, I don't know, a kind of sense of that progressive English imperialism, a very specific role that Britain can play as a kind of liberal empire in a wider sense that can gradually but slowly bring, you know, countries such as, or part of the world called India, to final independence. But it's not a simple story that they are simply racist or anything like that. In fact, they have the greatest admiration for so many of the people they meet in India compared to so many of the British administrators they meet in India. So the Webb's legacy on this is also deeply interesting too, well worth following up, as well as Laski's and all the other great figures who played a part in the history of the LSE, who then went on to play that role that you talked about within India.
Michael, thank you so much. And I'm now very, very pleased to hand back to our host, Simon, who's going to try and wrap it all up and bring it back to the modern LSE.
So no, I'm not going to say very much. I'm just going to thank you all for what I found an absolutely fascinating discussion. I certainly learned a lot from you all. I'd like to thank the audience for watching and I hope you enjoyed it. Please stay in touch, keep track. The next event we have as part of the series is on Leonard Woolf and Sri Lanka in the first week of June. And I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for chairing this and your great collaboration between LSE and the Fabian Society, which we hope is going to continue. So